From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
War is dehumanizing a whole new generation of this country and destroying the people in the country of Iraq. In order for us to reclaim our humanity as a military and as a country, we demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all troops from Iraq.
5 years ago today, the U.S. began bombing Baghdad. The war was on. Today, half a decade later, we bring you Winter Soldier, the eyewitness accounts of the soldiers who've lived it. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hundreds of events are planned around the country today to mark the 5th anniversary of the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Cities holding protests, sit-ins, and other gatherings include Washington, D.C., New York, Louisville, Chicago, Dallas, Miami, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. On Tuesday, activists with the anti-war group Code Pink marched along Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., disrupting traffic. Here in New York, the musicians Lou Reed and Laurie Anderson headlined a sold-out concert raising money for United for Peace and Justice and Iraq veterans against the war. In Afghanistan, at least 6 civilians have been killed in a U.S. raid on a southeastern village. The dead included 3 men, 2 children, and a woman. According to Oxfam, foreign troops were responsible for half of Afghanistan's 1,200 civilian deaths last year. On the campaign trail, Senator John McCain was caught in a major blunder Tuesday when he falsely insisted Iran is training and supplying al-Qaeda in Iraq. McCain corrected himself only after his colleague, Independent Senator Joseph Lieberman, stepped in and whispered into his ear.
Well, it's common knowledge and has been reported in the media that that al-Qaeda is going back into Iran and receiving training and are coming back into Iraq from Iran. That's well known, and it's unfortunate. So I believe that we are succeeding in Iraq. The situation is dramatically improved, but I also want to emphasize time and again, al-Qaeda is on the run, but they are not defeated.
You said that the Iranians were training al-Qaeda.
I'm sorry.
Training extremists.
I'm sorry. The Iranians are training extremists, not al-Qaeda. Not al-Qaeda. I'm sorry.
McCain, the Republican presidential candidate, made the comments in Jordan, which he visited en route to Israel from a brief trip in Iraq. On the Democratic side, Senator Barack Obama has again distanced himself from his former pastor, whose political views have brought national attention over the past week. Reverend Jeremiah Wright has been scrutinized in the media for linking the attacks of September 11th to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and for saying the country was founded on racism. On Tuesday, Obama said he disagreed with Wright on several issues but could not ignore their personal ties.
As imperfect as he may be, he has been like family to me. He strengthened my faith, officiated my wedding, and baptized my children. Not once in my conversations with him have I heard him talk about any ethnic group in derogatory terms, or treat whites with whom he interacted with anything but courtesy and respect. He contains within him the contradictions, the good and the bad, of the community that he has served diligently for so many years.
Observers say the speech is the first time Obama has extensively addressed the issue of race during his 15-month campaign. In other campaign news, Senator Hillary Clinton has picked up an endorsement from the influential Democratic Congressmember John Murtha. The backing is seen as a boost to Clinton ahead of next month's primary in Murtha's home state of Pennsylvania. In Tibet, the Chinese government is claiming more than 100 people have surrendered in the protests against Chinese rule. Tibetans faced a deadline of midnight on Monday to turn themselves in. The protests erupted last week when Buddhist monks took to the streets of Lhasa to mark the anniversary of the 1959 uprising against Chinese rule. Human rights groups say dozens of people have been killed and hundreds arrested in the Chinese crackdown. On Tuesday, the Dalai Lama said he would step down as Tibet's spiritual leader if the violence continues.
As early as 87, again this very room, the British journalist Jonathan Mursky, I interviewed here, and he asked me, if you see things become out of control, violence, then what do you do? Then I categorically read. Immediately I told, if things become out of control, then my only option is completely resign.
The protests have reportedly spread to ethnic Tibetan communities outside of Tibet. In Britain, the Venezuelan government has scored a victory in its legal dispute with the oil giant ExxonMobil. On Tuesday, a British court overturned a ruling freezing $12 billion in Venezuelan assets. Exxon had won the freeze as part of an attempt to recoup an investment in a nationalized Venezuelan oil project. But Venezuela says Exxon is trying to recover more than 10 times what its investment was actually worth. In Caracas, Venezuela oil minister Rafael Ramirez hailed the ruling as a vindication.
Exxon allá pretendía manipular y engañar a ese tribunal. Exxon intended to manipulate and lie to that court, and the court responded in a very serious manner and has put Exxon in its place. It is a lesson for transnational businesses, ExxonMobil in particular, who tried to be above the law. Ha pretendido estar por encima de la ley.
Venezuela and Exxon remain in arbitration over the dispute. In Colombia, the UN's calling for a probe into the deaths of 6 organizers of a recent protest against the Colombian government and paramilitary death squads. The victims included union workers and human rights activists. Tens of thousands of people took part in the protests on March 6th. Back in the United States, a group of Indian workers have filed suit against a U.S. oil construction firm for abusive working conditions in the shipyards in the American Gulf Coast. The lawsuit accuses Signal International of defrauding and exploiting over 500 Indian nationals who worked in Mississippi and Texas under federal guest worker programs. The Supreme Court has signaled it's prepared to overturn a handgun ban in Washington, D.C. On Tuesday, a majority of court justices appeared to lean towards ruling the Second Amendment provides individuals the right to own a handgun for self-defense. Washington, D.C. Mayor Adrian Fenty warned against repealing the handgun ban.
Colombia, more guns anywhere in the District of Columbia is going to lead to more crime, and that is why we stand so steadfastly against any repeal of our handgun ban.
The Supreme Court will rule on the case before adjourning in June. And the British science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke has died at the age of 90. Clarke was best known for writing 2001: A Space Odyssey, later adapted into the film. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 5 years ago tonight, on March 19, 2003, the U.S. began bombing Baghdad. The invasion was on. 6 weeks later, President Bush stood under a banner reading "Mission Accomplished" and declared an end to major military combat operations in Iraq. Now, half a decade later, the war continues with no end in sight. A speech today to mark the 5th anniversary, the president, who leaves office in less than 11 months, will again give an upbeat assessment of the war. According to released excerpts of his address, Bush will insist the so-called troop surge in Iraq has opened the door to a, quote, major strategic victory in the broader war on terror. But by most accounts, the war has been an unmitigated disaster. Up to 1 million Iraqis have been killed, with no estimates on the number of those wounded. Up to 2.5 million people are estimated to be displaced inside Iraq, and more than 2 million have fled to neighboring countries. Meanwhile, nearly 4,000 U.S. soldiers have been killed and tens of thousands more wounded. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz estimates the overall cost of this war will be $3 trillion. To mark this 5th anniversary of the invasion, hundreds of marches, sit-ins, and other protests are planned around the country. In Washington, D.C., demonstrators plan to block the entrance to the Internal Revenue Service and to disrupt the offices of K Street lobbyists who represent military contractors and oil companies profiting from the war. In New York, protesters from the Granny Peace Brigade will hold a knit-in at the Times Square Military Recruitment Center. In Chicago, a large rally and protest march is planned, while in Louisville, Kentucky, protesters will read aloud the names of some of the U.S. troops killed in the war. And college students from New Jersey to North Dakota are planning walkouts across their campuses. But perhaps some of the most powerful voices against the Iraq war have been the soldiers who have fought it. For 4 days this past weekend, soldiers convened at the National Labor College in Silver Spring, Maryland, for Winter Soldier, eyewitness accounts of the war and occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The corporate media largely ignored the story. For the past few days, we've been broadcasting their voices.